Thank you very much for inviting me. This is my first chance of being in Eskilstuna. I love broadening my horizons. So hopefully I can broaden your horizons a little bit about what I'm working on. And what I'm working on is this, the big picture. I'm a computational neuroscientist who ended up in the philosophy department of Oxford University because I couldn't keep to my topic. My advisor got many grey hairs from me not doing anything about brains or memory, but running off and studying a little bit about neural implants and, well, that's all right. A little bit about ethics, no, that doesn't sound very useful. And then writing papers about the future. And then I ended up in the philosophy department, so this is how it can go badly. And what I'm doing in the philosophy department of Oxford is working at the Future of Humanity Institute, and we got this lovely remit. We're supposed to look at the big picture, the long-range future of humanity. Not just the next 10 years, but questions about, well, where will we be in the next 100, or 1,000, or million, or actually trillion years? I'm actually working on a paper about that. It turns out that the expansion of the universe does have some nasty economic and ethical implications. But also, there are interesting questions about the threats and possibilities. What can we do with them? And how can we understand them better? So a lot of our research is about applied rationality, figuring out what's going on here. And this is where philosophers turn out to be surprisingly useful, because they get into these areas where there are no rules and try to figure out how to actually think carefully about them. After a few hundred years of mistakes and rather embarrassing papers, eventually somebody gets their act together, and it moves out and becomes its own department with nice funding, and everybody says, yeah, what has philosophy ever achieved? Look at economics, natural science, history, psychology. Yeah, economics and all those ones are useful. Philosophy part never seems to do anything. Well, hopefully we're doing something here. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about a first question. Well, what is the purpose of technology? And it's pretty obvious actually what it is. Magic. That is actually what we want to do. And here is a quote from a bona fide ceremonial magician, the slightly famous Aleister Crowley. This is his definition of magic. The science and art of causing change in conformance with will. And when we think about what we want our technology to do, is to get us what we want. Ideally, of course, in a very easy and convenient way, but the typical view in fairy tales of magic is that if you wish for something, and wish in the right way, even usually with fairy godmothers or wishing wells or something like that, you will get it. That is really what we want our technology to be like. We don't want just loose wishes to immediately turn real. That's kind of bad design. And we don't want it to be too hard. And we might even want to put in some limitations on it. But we certainly want to get this system working and actually create a fairy tale world. We actually want to create something a lot like our stories. And this is, of course, the enchanted forest we have achieved. And this is actually a very strange place. If we went back sufficiently far into history and asked our ancestors what they wished for, we'd say, oh yes, I want a world where I don't have to do backbreaking work all day to stay alive, and food should be really easy to available. Ideally, food with lots of fat and sugar and salt. That's yummy, that's yummy. And I don't want to get sick, and I want to live to a really ripe old age. And I think we have achieved that to some degree quite well. We might also notice that we might be should be a bit careful about what we wish for. Sometimes we do get it and realize, there are some problems here. Again, of course, the fairy tales point this out, and then usually get to the more about things should stay the same because that's the right thing. I think we can demonstrate actually that no, some things should change. And actually they are changing at an enormous rate. So we're living in the Anthropocene. Some of you might know about these geological ages, and there is an idea that we have left the Holocene and entered a new geological era, because the dominant geological force on Earth is no longer the normal form of erosion and activity of the biosphere, but actually humans. We are actually in I think the major factor causing erosion of rock right now. Humanity is fixating 190 million tons of nitrogen every year, which is about as much as the rest of the biosphere together. We're changing the geology of the planet on an enormous rate. Sometimes, of course, not for the better. But quite a lot of it is to our benefit. We're the most common large mammal on the planet. And we can be found everywhere. Actually, the total human biomass is simply staggering. We're outweighing most other big mammals, except, of course, for our domestic animals. In fact, we're creating a kind of domesticated world. Today, only 10% of the non-frozen land area of Earth is more than 48 hours away from the nearest big city. It's actually not that much wilderness left. And that means that we need to think about how we care about our planet, of course. And I could launch into the standard spiel here about climate change, etc. But, well, I'm rather optimistic. I'm more interested in how can we learn to be better at this? And where does robots come into this? Well, obviously, we want that change to happen according to our intentions. But our intentions are very muddled, and we're not always around to do these intentions. So sometimes we need somebody else or something else to do what we want. We also spread widely around. There might also be that we like to have company. There is a reason why so many robots are interesting and cute, because we also are very good at thinking socially. A lot of our brain is actually dealing with the kind of ongoing soap opera of human relationships. And that is important because we use that to understand physics too. We understand a lot of the world in social terms. So by actually adding a little bit of autonomy to our devices, we might make them easier to manage. And of course, we create the talking animals for that enchanted forest. Okay, what are the trends that are affecting us right now? Well, here is a bunch. I'm going to jump past them relatively quickly, because most of them, of course, are fairly well known. Generally, we are having a bigger population. We're getting fewer kids, so we're aging rather quickly. Most people live in cities. They might range from very nice ones to the rather nasty ones. We're actually getting richer, and even the poorest ones. It's just that, of course, we might be discussing the differences here. The world is definitely getting very globalized. It's not just that we're running out of resources, we're also reusing and reinventing what we're using resource for. So suddenly rare earths are a big political issue, and people realize that, copper, well, that's nice, but fiber optics is better. And we need to deal that we have inadvertently created links between our social systems and our technological system and the climate systems in ways we don't really intend it. Oops. But it happens all the time. Similarly, society is changing in a lot of interesting ways. Of course, it's also popular to be scared these days, so we might worry about our security. We need much more education, and well, that's a problem, because if we're getting educated well enough, we're too old to work eventually. And all this change, all this globalization, all these links forces us to renegotiate a lot of our ideas. What about surveillance and privacy? The old norms have to be changing because we have got cell phones and cameras everywhere. I have a surveillance camera every 18 meters between my home and my office in Oxford. And it's coming to Sweden too. Even though it might not be the official cameras, it might be people's cell phone cameras. And then, of course, we have a democratization. People actually demanding much more control over their lives. But most importantly, of course, at least for this audience, is that technology is doing an awful lot of fun stuff. We're having a lot of technologies, not just computers, but that are accelerating. Not all of them fast enough. Japanese beer is getting exponentially cheaper, but at a fairly slow rate, which is maybe a bit sad if you happen to like Sapporo beer. We're getting enormous amounts of data that we can manipulate. We're getting smart into practically everything. There are wireless connections in more and more things, and as we get cheap plastic electronics and low power electronics, it's getting more and more sensible to add it to anything, which of course means that they can do surveillance. And as I'm going to return to, a lot of them are actually going to be robot ready. There are actually already sensors and actuators that you could use for robotic applications. And we like to automate things because it makes things cheaper and more efficiently, and humans are actually quite expensive. And we want to adjust it. Okay, where does that lead us? Let me give you a few examples here and look at the health, obviously. When we're needing a lot more health because we're getting older and people are going to be having various chronic diseases for a long time. It's also getting more expensive. People have proposed, for example, telemedicine, where you can use lab on a chip to make tests that previously would have required a trip to the hospital lab in order to do it in the home. In the long run, we might be seeing that people get various robotic automation to help them in the home, like we saw in that early video. But right now, it's probably mostly communication. But it's actually important to try to automate medicine as much as possible. So speaking as somebody in the philosophy department, I would say we have a moral obligation to make more medical robots. It's not just that it would be good business. It's actually something we ought to be doing quite strongly. Why? It's not just because it's expensive to healthcare costs. It's also very important in order to distribute it to the poor people. Typically, gadgets tend to come down exponentially in price over time. We learn how to produce them cheaply and we develop better tools for it. Services tend to remain at the same price because you need to pay that doctor, that nurse, those people who are actually running the hospital. Okay, so how can we fix that? Well, what if we turn medicine into a gadget? Of course, it's pretty hard to do everything in medicine as a gadget. We can't really all go around with these Da Vinci surgical robots at our home, mostly because we don't need surgery all the time, fortunately. Of course, if it was sufficiently good, maybe we would be using surgery all the time because it would be so fun. But everything we could automate in medicine and turn into gadgets would actually be morally a good thing because now we could distribute it eventually and across the world much more efficiently. This is, of course, an interesting example also that something that's morally good and economically good might still be very hard to implement because